New York City, October. The kind of evening where the Upper East Side puts on its best face. Warm light spilling from tall windows, black cars lined up along the curb, women in gowns moving through marble doorways like they were born to them. The Langford Museum of Art, one of the most exclusive charity galas of the season. 200 guests, $10,000 a plate. Inside, crystal chandeliers, white orchids, the soft pull of a string quartet underneath the hum of old money and careful conversation. And somewhere in that room, standing very still at the edge of it all, a young woman in a $47 dress. She isn't lost, she isn't nervous, she's watching. Across the room, a man laughs with his whole body, silver at his temples. The easy warmth of someone who has never once questioned whether he belongs anywhere. She watches him. He doesn't watch her back, not yet. But the fight is just beginning. And she already knows how it ends. She already knew what they were going to do. She just needed to watch them do it. That was the whole point. That was why she was sitting in the back of a taxi on a Thursday evening in October, watching the Upper East Side slide past the window, wearing a dress that cost $47. She'd bought it herself, walked into the store, pulled it off the rack, paid cash. No one helped her pick it. She'd stood in her apartment bathroom afterward, the light a little too yellow, the reflection a little too honest, and she'd taken off the small gold earrings she'd put on. Set them on the edge of the sink. Looked again, better. Or worse, depending on who was doing the looking. She picked up her clutch, real leather, small, the kind that doesn't announce itself, and walked out the door. The taxi smelled like pine air freshener and old coffee. The driver had a talk radio station on low. Some man was arguing about something. She didn't listen closely enough to find out what. It all sounded the same at this hour. Her name was Naomi Carter. She was 25 years old. She ran the operations of the Carter Foundation, which meant she managed relationships with 63 partner organizations, oversaw a grant portfolio of significant size, and spent most of her working hours thinking about what it meant to put money where it actually did something, instead of somewhere it looked good. Her father was Joseph Carter, CEO of Carter Global Tech, net worth somewhere north of $14 billion. A man whose name appeared in financial headlines often enough that his assistant kept a separate folder just for press inquiries. Joseph did not know Naomi was in this taxi tonight. He knew about the gala. He knew the foundation had sponsored it. He knew in the way that large organizations know things, that a table had been reserved and someone from the foundation would attend. He did not know that someone was her. He did not know she had called Dr. Harriet Stowe, the museum director, 3 weeks ago and asked, very quietly, very specifically, that her attendance not be announced or noted in any program materials. He did not know she had spoken 2 days ago to her personal attorney, not the foundation's legal team, hers. And he absolutely did not know what she was planning to find out. Douglas Vance. The name had been living in her head for 6 weeks. Douglas Vance, CEO of Vance Capital, 55 years old, Georgetown MBA, board seats on 3 financial institutions. The kind of man whose handshake appeared in the section, and whose smile appeared in the lifestyle section, and whose debts appeared nowhere at all. Her father trusted him. That was the problem. Joseph was preparing to sign an $800 million partnership agreement with Vance Capital. Joint venture, 5-year term. The kind of deal that would reshape the Carter Global portfolio in ways that would take years to fully trace. Naomi believed in evidence, always had. She'd read everything publicly available about Vance Capital, the annual reports, the shareholder letters. The profile in a business magazine from 2 years ago, where Douglas described his leadership philosophy as people first. She'd reviewed the transcripts of his congressional testimonies. She'd gone through the composition of his executive team going back 8 years. She'd found patterns, not proof, patterns. The kind you notice when you've spent 3 years sitting across tables from people who want your foundation's money and learning the difference between what they say and what they mean. The executive team at Vance Capital was 91% white, not unusual for finance. But the turnover among minority hires in the last 4 years ran 3 times the industry average. There was a discrimination complaint filed 18 months ago against a Vance Capital subsidiary, settled out of court, sealed, barely mentioned anywhere. Sealed, settled, gone. Except Naomi had a friend who knew someone who'd worked there. She'd had coffee with that person last month. Listened for 2 hours, didn't record it, didn't take notes, just listened. And then she'd bought the dress and called Doc Stowe. The plan was straightforward. She would walk into the Langford Museum Gala as a Foundation representative, which she was, because she was, and she would watch Douglas Vance in a room where he didn't know he was being evaluated. She would see how he moved, who he spoke to, how he treated the people around him who didn't register as important. She would collect evidence. She had expected to spend a quiet evening at the edges of a room full of expensive dresses and careful conversations. She had expected to leave with impressions, with data, with a clearer sense of whether her instincts about Douglas Vance were worth bringing to her father. She had not expected the evening to accelerate quite so quickly, but she had prepared for the possibility that it might. That was why she'd called her attorney. The Langford Museum sat on the Upper East Side like it had always been there and always intended to be. Its stone facade lit from below, warm gold light washing up the columns. A short red carpet ran from the curb to the entrance. 2 attendants in white gloves held the door for guests. Naomi watched a woman step out of a car ahead of her, diamonds at her throat. A gown that had been constructed, not purchased. Hair that had been arranged by someone who charged by the hour. The woman walked forward without pausing, like the carpet existed specifically for her arrival. Naomi got out of the taxi. No one moved toward her door. She tipped the driver well and tugged her clutch under her arm and walked to the entrance. One of the white-gloved attendants glanced at her. A full-body scan completed in under 2 seconds. He didn't move toward the door. She opened it herself. Inside. Warmth, champagne on silver trays, white orchids arranged in tall vases, a string quartet in the far corner playing something that floated above the views of several hundred conversations. The particular suspended energy of a room designed to make certain people feel important, which always produces the inverse effect on everyone else. Naomi took a glass of water from a passing tray. Not champagne. Water. She moved to the edge of the room, found a position near one of the large display cases, ancient pottery. She didn't look closely, and began to work. She found Douglas Vance in 11 minutes. He was standing near the center of the room in a group of 4 men, all tuxos, all with the posture of people who'd been wearing tuxedos since their teen. He was taller than she'd expected from photographs, silver at his temples, the tan now and unclear as a boat. He laughed at something, and the laugh traveled through his whole body, head tilting back, hand coming up to the other man's shoulder. It looked genuine. That was the thing about Douglas Vance. It always looked genuine. She'd seen it in interviews. The warmth, the accessibility, the way he made whoever he was speaking to feel like the most interesting person nearby. She watched him for 4 minutes without moving. She watched how he responded to a server who came too close and jostled his arm. Small nod, no irritation, but no real acknowledgement either. The server wasn't a person to him, just part of the furniture. She watched how his expression shifted when a woman in a green dress approached the group. A slight recalibration before the smile reappeared, the kind of micro-adjustment most people would miss. Naomi did not miss it. She was still watching when she felt someone looking at her. Eleanor Vance was 52 years old, married to Douglas for 28 years. She sat on the boards of 4 charities and was known in certain circles for a quality that was hard to estimate precisely. Call it social precision. The ability to read a room, to identify exactly where a situation required intervention, and to move before anyone else had registered a problem. She was standing 12 feet from Naomi, speaking to a woman in ivory, and her eyes were elsewhere, on Naomi. Not curious eyes, assessment eyes, the look of someone running a calculation. Naomi held her gaze for 1 second, then looked back at Douglas. That was, she would understand later, the moment Eleanor decided something. The approach took 3 minutes. Eleanor said something brief to the woman in ivory. A touch on the arm, a smile that said, "This conversation is paused," and walked directly toward Naomi with the unhurried authority of someone who has never needed to rush toward anything in her life. She stopped 2 feet away. She looked Naomi up and down, not subtle about it. The look was designed to be seen. "I don't think we've met." Her voice was smooth. The voice of someone who had spent decades making sentences sound like invitations when they were assessments. I'm Eleanor Vance. Naomi. Eleanor waited. Last affiliation. The social currency that established context. Naomi offered none. Eleanor's smile held. Something behind it shifted. And you're here this evening as a guest of the foundation. Which foundation, darling? Several are represented tonight. Carter Foundation. A pause. Brief. Eleanor's eyes moved to Naomi's dress, her shoes, her clutch. The calculation completing itself in real time. How wonderful, Eleanor said. The tone made clear she found it nothing of the sort. She excused herself and came back with Briggs. Briggs Vance was 27. He had his father's height and his mother's instinct for territory. He held his phone in his right hand the way other people hold a drink, automatically, without thinking, because his thumb knew how to open it before his brain had formed an intention. He was already recording when he reached Naomi. Not obviously. The phone was angled low, pointed somewhere between them, casual enough to look accidental. It wasn't accidental. Mom says you're with the Carter Foundation? He said it like a question, but with the tone of someone who's already reached a verdict. That's right, huh? He looked at her the way he probably looked at comments on his videos, scanning, categorizing, sorting into keep or discard. I didn't see you on the list. I'm on the list. Cool, cool. He wasn't listening. His eyes had moved to his screen. It's just that my mom coordinates these events, and she knows basically everyone who. She doesn't know me. He looked up. Something like surprise crossed his face. He wasn't used to being interrupted. Right, exactly. He smiled, the kind that stops at the teeth. So that's kind of the thing. Naomi said nothing. Briggs glanced past her shoulder. His mother was coming back. With Sloane. Sloane Vance was 24 and beautiful in the way of someone who had been told she was beautiful so consistently that she had stopped registering it as a fact and simply inhabited it as a condition, the way you inhabit being tall or right-handed. She held her phone up, not angled low, just raised, like she was mid-story pausing a broadcast, which Naomi would realize was exactly what she was doing. Okay, Sloane said to no one in the room and the followers watching from outside it. So this is what I was telling you about. She gestured toward Naomi with a small laugh. The laugh said, "Can you believe this?" Naomi felt the air shift. Not dramatically. The way it shifts when attention moves, when a group of people orient themselves around a point. She didn't turn to see who was watching. Your invitation, Eleanor said. Her voice had changed. The warmth was gone. She held out one hand, palm up, the way you extend your hand to a stranger's dog. Naomi reached into her clutch and drew out the cream envelope, handed it over. Eleanor took it, looked at it. And without hesitation, without drama, without even a drawn breath, she tore it in half. The sound was small, crisp. It cut through the ambient noise like something striking glass. The pieces fell to the marble floor. I think, Eleanor said to the room more than to Naomi, we have a situation. Across the room, Douglas Vance felt his phone vibrate in his jacket pocket. He didn't reach for it. He was watching his wife from 20 feet away, and he was doing the thing he had always been good at. Reading a situation and calculating the cost of each available move. He had heard Eleanor say Carter Foundation when she'd returned to him briefly a few minutes ago. Her voice low and quick. He had heard the name and his mind had snagged on it the way a sleeve snags on a rough edge. Carter Foundation. He knew that name. He knew it from the event program, which listed the foundation as a platinum sponsor. He knew it from his own business files, where Joseph Carter's name appeared with increasing frequency as their partnership negotiations had progressed. He had not connected it to the young woman until this exact moment. His phone vibrated again. He glanced at the screen. His chief of staff. Not Joseph Carter. His chief of staff who had been trying to reach him about a scheduling conflict for tomorrow's breakfast meeting. Something that had nothing to do with any of this. He declined it, looked back at his wife, looked at the young woman standing in the middle of the room with the torn pieces of her invitation scattered at her feet. He understood now exactly who she was, and he stood very still and said nothing. That was the choice, not dramatic, not loud. Just the quiet arithmetic of a man who calculated that intervening would require explaining why he'd waited this long to intervene. And so he waited longer and longer, until waiting became its own decision, irrevocable and witnessed by everyone in the room who was paying attention. Which, as it turned out, was everyone. The circle formed quickly. No one signaled anyone. But the human pull toward conflict is old and strong, and within 90 seconds there were perhaps 20 people in the near ring and another 40 beyond them. And Officer Terz Boyle was moving through the crowd from the south end of the room with his jaw already tight. Boyle was 45, a careful man. She could read it in how he moved, shoulders controlled, pace measured, the bearing of someone who did not enjoy scenes. Briggs had stopped pretending. The phone was up now, held at chest height. He was talking into it at low volume, just enough for the microphone. Sloane had stepped back half a step to improve her angle. Her comments section, visible at the bottom of her screen, was moving fast. Eleanor stood at the center of all of it, with the stillness of someone who has managed difficult situations before, and knows that stillness reads as authority. This young woman, she said, addressing the room generally, presented an invitation that appears to be fraudulent. I think we handle this transparently. Someone in the crowd murmured agreement. Someone else raised a phone. The museum's photographer, a quiet man in a dark jacket who had been working the room's edges all evening, raised his camera and pressed the shutter. Naomi looked at the torn CDs of her invitation on the floor. She considered picking them up. She didn't. She stood with both hands at her sides, her clutch tucked under her left arm, her face arranged not into blankness but into presence. Not performing calm, not working at it. Just here, just breathing, just watching while the room made every decision it was going to make. Because that was what this room didn't understand yet. She was not the one making mistakes tonight. She was watching someone else make them. Every word Eleanor said was information. The torn invitation, information. Briggs's camera angle, information. Sloane's laugh, information. And most importantly, most critically, Douglas Vance, who had been standing near the room's center 12 minutes ago and was now at the outer edge of the cigaring circle, his face arranged into something between concern and detachment. He was not intervening. He could have. He was 10 feet away. He knew who Carter Foundation was. His quarterly earnings call had included a reference to Joseph Carter's name not 3 weeks prior. He stood still, which was nothing, and Naomi understood that she now knew exactly what she had come to find out. Dr. Adaze Okafor was standing 11 feet to Naomi's left. Naomi hadn't noticed her arrive. She was a woman in her late 40s, in a deep burgundy gown, and she was watching all of this with an expression that had moved, was still moving, from discomfort into something harder. Near the far wall, half behind a display column, an older woman sat in a chair with her hands folded in her lap, and her very quietly, recording everything. Naomi didn't know her yet. She would. Boyle reached the inner edge of the circle. He addressed Naomi quietly. Professional. Unhappy about all of it. Ma'am, I need to verify your invitation status. Of course. That was Eleanor, before Naomi could respond. The evidence is right there on the floor, officer. We've handled this as openly as possible. Boyle looked at the torn pieces. Looked at Naomi. His expression said he didn't love single part of this. Dr. Harriet Stowe arrived at his left shoulder. She had a tablet clutched to her chest, and the look of someone who has been running toward a fire they are afraid to find still burning. Her fingers were moving on the screen before she'd fully stopped walking. She scrolled, stopped, looked up, found Naomi's face. Something moved through her expression like weather crossing open ground. She looked back at the tablet, then at Eleanor, then at Boyle. She leaned close to him and said something Naomi couldn't hear. Boyle's face changed. Eleanor noticed. Whatever on that tablet, Eleanor said smoothly, stepping forward. I assure you, Harriet, we've all seen what's in front of us. The Vance family has been supporting this institution for 11 years. Surely that counts for something. Stowe looked at Eleanor for a long moment, pressed her lips together, then looked at Naomi. She didn't speak yet, but the look said, I know, I'm sorry. I should have been faster. Douglas had moved closer, not into the inner circle, but close enough that Naomi could see his face clearly now, and what she saw was a man caught between two different instincts with no good option on either side. His phone had buzzed in his pocket twice. She'd seen him glance at it, decline something, go back to watching. She had a reasonable guess who was calling. Eleanor's voice had taken on a new note. Conclusion, decision, Officer Boyle. She addressed him with the tone of someone closing a meeting. I'm formally requesting that this young woman be removed from premises. Applause from somewhere in the crowd, scattered, real. Boyle moved toward Naomi. His face said, "I'm sorry." His feet said, "I don't have a choice." "Miss," he said, very quietly, "I'm going to have to ask you." "I understand," Naomi said. Her voice came out calm. Not the calm of effort. The calm of someone who has been waiting for this exact moment. She reached into her clutch. Not for identification. Not for her foundation credentials. Not for anything that would explain her presence in the way Eleanor wanted it explained. For her phone. She looked up at Boyle, then past him at Eleanor, whose chin was raised and whose eyes held the brightness of someone who believes they have won something. Then she looked at Douglas. He looked back at her. She held that look for 3 full seconds. Let him sit inside it. Let him understand, if he was willing to be that honest with himself, that she had watched him. Every choice he'd made tonight, every calculation, every silence, she'd seen all of it. Then she looked at her phone and dialed. It connected on the first ring. "I need you at the Langford," she said. "Right now. Come alone." She hung up. Slid the phone into her clutch, clicked it shut. Eleanor's expression had a new quality at its edge. Not quite the certainty it had held 30 seconds ago. Something had entered the room, not a person yet, just the possibility of one, and it had changed the air in a way Eleanor could feel but not yet name. "I'll wait outside," Naomi said to Boyle. Not to Eleanor, to Boyle. "I'd appreciate it if you walked with me." She turned. She walked toward the entrance with steady steps. The crowd parted. No one said anything. The string quartet had stopped playing. She hadn't noticed exactly when. But after a beat of silence, they began again. Something slower, something that suited the new temperature of the room. Because even the people who had been applauding 40 seconds ago could feel it. Something was not finished. Something had barely started. Outside, the night air was cool and direct. Naomi stood on the top step above the carpet and looked out at the street. The city was doing what cities do, taxis, horns in the middle distance, the low hum of everything moving at once. Boyle stood 2 steps below her, hands clasped, eyes on a fixed point in the middle distance. "You knew," he said. Not a question. She didn't answer. "Dr. Stowe's tablet," he said. "She found something." "Yes." A pause. "Who did you call?" "Someone who needed to know where I was." He nodded slowly. He'd been doing this job for 22 years. He had a long catalog of things he'd seen. He hadn't seen quite this. They stood in silence for a few minutes. The city moved below them. A black car pulled up to the curb, quiet engine, no markings. The door opened. Joseph Carter stepped out. He was 58 years old, and he looked like a man who had stopped what he was doing and come immediately. Jacket on, tie straight, nothing in his hands. He walked up the steps and stopped in front of his daughter. He looked at her the way fathers look at daughters when they need the answer to one question. "I'm fine," she said. He read her face. He'd been reading her face since she was 3 years old. He believed her. "Tell me," he said. "Inside," she said. "They need to hear it too." He looked at the museum doors, back at her. He didn't ask for more. He didn't offer to handle anything. He straightened slightly and waited. And Naomi Carter turned and walked back through the doors she had been escorted out of. Back into the marble hall. Back into the light. Back into the room full of people who had spent the last hour deciding who she was. It was time to let them find out. She walked back through those doors like she owned the floor beneath her feet, which in a manner of speaking she did. The marble was cold under the thin soles of her shoes. The light hit her the same way it had an hour ago. Warm, golden, designed to flatter. But the room had a different quality now. The air carried a charge, the kind that builds before something breaks. Not after, before. People noticed her return before they registered Joseph behind her. A ripple moved through the crowd, heads turning, elbows finding ribs. The soft percussion of 200 people revising what they thought they understood about the last hour. Naomi didn't slow down. She moved through the parting crowd toward the center of the room, not performing anything, not announcing anything. Just moving with the quiet directness of someone who knows exactly where she is going and has decided to go there. Straight to where Eleanor Vance was standing. Eleanor had been holding court. In the 10 minutes since Naomi McBee had been walked out, she had transformed the space around her into something that functioned like a verdict. She stood with Sloane on her left and 2 women Naomi didn't recognize on her right. And she was speaking in the low, satisfied register of someone recounting a situation that has been resolved. Past tense, filed away, done, except she felt Naomi before she saw her. It was the crowd that told her. The shift in attention. Conversations dropping mid-sentence. Sloane's eyes moving to a point over Eleanor's shoulder and staying there. Eleanor turned. She saw Naomi, and behind Naomi, one step back Joseph Carter. Eleanor had never met Joseph Carter in person, but she had seen his photograph. Everyone in New York finance had seen his photograph enough times that his face had become a kind of shorthand. A specific kind of success, a specific kind of weight. She recognized him in 1 second, and in that same second she understood, not everything, enough. The color left her face the way a tide goes out. Quietly, without announcement, Joseph walked to Naomi's side and stood there. That was all he did. He didn't address the crowd. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't reach for authority or presence. He simply stood beside his daughter in his good suit, with his hands relaxed at his sides. And somehow that was louder than anything he could have said. Briggs, who had been filming from 8 feet away, watched his father across the room. Watched Douglas's face. Watched something in his father's expression crack open the way old pavement cracks, in a hard freeze, not all at once, but along every fault line simultaneously. For the first time all evening, Briggs lowered his phone. Not all the way, just an inch, which was more than he'd lowered it in the last 90 minutes. Sloane's Instagram was still live. Her comment section was moving so fast the words blurred together. She could see fragments forming. Who is that? Who just walked in? Wait, is that? And she couldn't finish reading fast enough to understand what was happening. But she could feel it happening, and feeling it was enough to make her thumb hover over the end button without quite pressing it. Dr. Harriet Stowe pushed through the outer edge of the crowd. She reached Naomi first. Her face was the face of a woman who has been sitting with terrible knowledge for 10 minutes and needs to set it down somewhere. Mrs. Carter. Her voice was low, controlled, the control of significant effort. I owe you a profound apology on behalf of this institution. Not yet, Naomi said. Stowe blinked. Not yet? There's something I'd like to do first. She turned to face the room. Not the inner circle. Not just the 60 people closest to her, the whole room. All 200 of them, the ones still holding phones and the ones who'd lowered them, and the ones pretending they hadn't been watching, who were absolutely watching. Her voice came out clear, not raised, just clear in the way that fills a room when a room has been waiting for something to fill it. I had to ask Mr. Vance a question. Douglas, who had moved to the edge of the nearest cluster of guests, went very still. The room went still with him. Mr. Vance. She looked directly at him across the open space. When did you realize who I was? Silence. The specific silence of a room in which everyone knows the answer to a question and is waiting to see if the person being asked will say it. Douglas opened his mouth, closed it. His eyes moved to Eleanor, to Joseph, to the floor, back to Naomi. The full circuits of someone who has run out of directions. He started. Take your time, she said. She didn't say it cruelly. She said it the way you say take your time when you mean I have the rest of this evening and everything that follows it. Douglas said nothing, and the nothing was the answer. Complete and irrefutable, and witnessed 200 people and every phone camera still running in the room. I see, Naomi said. 2 words, quiet as a door closing on something that cannot be reopened. In those 2 words, Douglas Vance understood the full dimension of what his silence had cost him. Not just the silence of the last 10 minutes. Every version of silence he had ever chosen when the alternative was harder. The man who described his leadership philosophy as people first had stood 10 feet from a woman being publicly degraded and done his arithmetic and said nothing. The arithmetic had come out wrong. From the south side of the room, someone stood up. She'd been sitting in a chair against the wall, half behind a display column, since before all of this began. Silver hair pulled back simply. A dark green dress with no ornamentation. She moved the way people move when they've spent decades in rooms where everyone knew who they were. Which was accurate. Judge Renata Wycliffe had retired from the federal bench 14 months ago after 29 years. She had presided over more discrimination cases than she could number from memory. Written opinions still being cited in current proceedings. She had spent nearly 3 decades developing a very specific instinct, the instinct for a room where power is being used against someone who has no immediate recourse. And that instinct had been firing without interruption for the last hour. She walked into the center of the space and held up her phone. I've been recording since Mrs. Vance made physical contact with this young woman and took her invitation. She said it to the room, not as accusation, as fact, the way she had stated facts for 29 years. I have 33 minutes of footage from this angle alone. Sloane's hand rose to her mouth. Briggs looked at his phone as if it had become something he didn't recognize. I also want to tell you, Judge Wycliffe continued, that I have been advising on a civil investigation into employment practices at a Vance Capital subsidiary for the past 4 months. Tonight's events are directly relevant to that investigation. The footage I've recorded, along with whatever other recordings exist in this room, will be in the hands of Rastambalith's first thing tomorrow morning. She looked at Douglas. Douglas looked back at her, and the sound in the room was extraordinary, not loud. The opposite of loud. The sound of 200 people simultaneously deciding not to speak. Dr. Aziz Okafor stepped forward. She'd been watching long enough, standing still long enough, holding her silence past the point where silence was neutral and into the territory where it was something else. She was a surgeon. She had spent 20 years making fast decisions in high-pressure rooms where the cost of hesitation was not professional but human. She was not someone who held back when the moment required her. I want to say something, she said, loud enough to carry across the room. As a witness. Eleanor looked at her. The looks that said, "You don't need to do this." A Daisy looked back. Her look said, "Watch me." I watched this young woman stand in the middle of this room for over 30 minutes while people filmed her and laughed and called her a gate crasher. She never raised her voice. She never lost herself. A pause that had weight in it. I can't say the same for everyone else here tonight. Someone in the crowd made a sound. Agreement or discomfort, impossible to tell the difference. Probably both. Eleanor straightened her spine. Adaze, I understand you feel strongly, but this is a private. There are 200 people and at least 50 recording devices in this room, Adaze said. Nothing about tonight is private anymore. The silence that followed was different from the silences that had come before it. Those had been the silences of shock, of people scrambling to update their understanding. This one was deliberative. Douglas looked at his wife. Eleanor's face was composed, but her eyes were working, processing. She was a woman who had spent 52 years navigating power, and she understood now, with the terrible clarity of intelligence applied too late, that she had walked into something she had not seen coming. There had been a version of tonight where none of this happened, where she had seen a young black woman in a simple dress, and let her stand where she wanted to stand, and do whatever she had come to do. That version had existed. Eleanor had chosen against it. Repeatedly, without pause, and now she was here. She looked at Douglas. He looked back at her. 28 years of marriage compressed into 6 seconds. He turned to Naomi. "We accept your conditions," he said, not with his whole-body laugh, not with the warmth he deployed so easily, just words. Honest ones, which was, she thought, possibly the most honest thing he'd said all evening. Joseph Carter had not spoken. He had stood to Naomi's left and watched everything and said nothing, and his face had been doing something complicated that he had spent 40 years learning to keep off his face in professional situations. He had not been prepared for this, not the specifics. He'd known in a general way that Naomi was going to the gala. He'd known she had questions about Douglas Vance. He had not known she was going alone, dressed simply, holding a foundation invitation without announcing who her father was. He understood now what she had done. She had designed a test, precise and patient, and carried out without telling him, because as if she'd told him, he would have had opinions about it. He would have wanted to help. He would have, in the way of fathers who love their children and also trust their own judgment considerably, made it into something different. She had known that, so she hadn't told him, and Douglas Vance had failed the test in front of 200 witnesses, and a retired federal judge, and an unknown number of phone cameras. Joseph looked at his daughter. She was standing straight, both hands at her sides, her face clear and composed, and entirely in command of whatever was happening beneath it. She was 25 years old. He felt something arrive in his chest without warning, the kind of feeling that doesn't announce itself, just appears and sits there quietly, and changes the quality of everything around it. He recognized it. He'd felt it before, when she was 17 and had stood up at a board meeting where she wasn't supposed to speak and explained, concisely and without apology, why the foundation's largest grant of that year was going to the wrong organization. He'd felt it then. He felt it now. Larger pride, the kind that almost aches. Now Naomi was speaking again. She had turned back to Douglas, and her voice had the quality it got when she was moving through the logical steps of something she had thought through completely. "I came tonight," she said, "because my father is preparing to sign an $800 million partnership with Vance Capital." She said it to the room as much as to Douglas. Even, clear. "I came to understand what kind of man you are when no one you consider important is watching." A breath. "Now I know." Douglas's jaw tightened. "Mrs. Carter, if I had known who you were." "Yes." She let the word stand alone. That's exactly the problem. She gave it a moment. Let it be heard by all of them. "I'd like to make a proposal," she said. "Not just to Mr. Vance, to everyone in this room." She reached into her clutch and drew out the torn halves of her invitation. Held them up so the room could see what they were. Cream paper, embossed lettering, her name on it, clean and clear. "The Carter Foundation donated $100,000 to this museum for tonight's event," she said. "We fund arts education for children across New York who would otherwise never set foot in a building like this one." She set the pieces on the nearest table. "I'd like you to sit with that for a moment." The room sat with it. "Now," she said, and her voice shifted, not softer, steadier, "here is what I'm proposing." She laid out the conditions in plain language. No corporate framing, no carefully constructed softening, just sentences, direct and sequential and witnessed by everyone in the room. A full public accounting of tonight's events. Not managed, not shaped by Vance Capital's communications team. A statement acknowledging what happened and what it revealed, reviewed and approved by Carter Foundation before release. Mandatory bias training for the entire Vance Capital Leadership Board. Not a one-day seminar checked off a list. An ongoing program it would independently designed by an organization chosen by Carter Foundation, assessed quarterly, with results reported to an independent review committee. A full independent audit of Vance Capital's hiring and promotion practices over the past 5 years. The findings to be shared relevant risk organizations and, where applicable, with Judge Wycliffe's ongoing investigation. A fund of $2 million, administered not by Vance Capital, but through a board composed of Carter Foundation representatives and independent community members. Dedicated to organizations working on racial equity in New York's financial sector. And the final condition, the one that made Eleanor's breath catch. Vance Capital will fund 50 full scholarships for Black students pursuing degrees in finance, business, and technology over the next 5 years, Naomi said. Her voice was level, unhurried. These scholarships will be administered entirely under the Carter Foundation name. The Vance family name will not appear in any materials, any announcements, or any communications related to this program. In any form. Ever. The room was absolutely quiet. "You will fund this. You will be required to fund this. And you will receive no public credit for it." She looked at Eleanor directly. "You will do good quietly. The way people who are genuinely sorry do good. Without an audience." It's Eleanor's face. It was the face of a woman who has just understood the true architecture of what she is being required to do. Not the dramatic, visible kind of apology, the kind that gets photographed and written about and generates a certain sympathy. The kind that happens privately, over years, without anyone watching. The kind where you give and no one ever knows it was you. The kind that costs something real. Douglas looked at Joseph. Joseph returned the look with an expression that gave away nothing, which was itself a complete answer. "If you meet these conditions," Naomi said, "Carter Global will honor the partnership agreement. Modified terms. A probationary period of 18 months. Quarterly review. And at my discretion in consultation with the Independent Audit Committee." At her discretion, not Joseph's. Douglas heard it. The room heard it. "If you don't meet these conditions," she continued, "Carter Global withdraws from the agreement effective tonight. Judge Wycliffe's investigation proceeds with this evening's documentation as supporting material, and I will personally recommend every foundation partner we work with, 63 organizations, that they conduct their own reviews of any Vance Capital involvement." She stopped. "Let the full shape of it settle. That's everything. Take whatever time you need." She stepped back and waited. Douglas looked at Eleanor again. This time, the look between them was different. not the compressed calculation of 28 years. Something more fundamental. Two people who have been building something together for a long time, looking at what the building actually is. Eleanor's hands were still. Her face had moved past the initial shock into something quieter and somehow more difficult to look at. She gave him the smallest nod. He turned to Naomi. "We accept your conditions." The room exhaled. Briggs looked at his phone screen. The tick-tock was still live, somehow, through all of it, still running. He looked at the view count and felt his stomach drop and then drop further, and then do something that had no real physical equivalent. The number was large, very large, the kind of large that doesn't stay in a moment. It moves outward, spreads, becomes permanent. The comments were coming too fast to read individually, but he caught fragments. And the fragments were not what they had been 40 minutes ago. Not laughing, not agreeing with him, not saying the things he'd narrated into his microphone as though they were obvious truths. They were saying things like, "This is history," and "She just changed everything," and in different fonts and different levels of emphasis over and over, we saw all of it. He pressed end. The number froze. He put the phone in his pocket. He looked at Naomi. She wasn't looking at him. She was listening to something Judge Wycliffe was saying, her head slightly inclined, her expression attentive. She looked like someone finishing a meeting that had gone the way it needed to go. Not triumphant, not relieved, just present. He thought about the 33 minutes of footage on the judge's phone, his own videos. Sloane's stream and the screenshots already moving across platforms without anyone's permission. He thought about what his mother had told the room, that this young woman didn't belong here. He thought about the $100,000 and the children's arts programs and the scholarship fund his father had just agreed to fund under conditions that would not allow any of them to take credit for a single dollar of it. He thought about how his father had stood 10 feet away and said nothing. He thought about how he himself had held up a camera and narrated. Something moved through him. Not guilt exactly. Guilt was too manageable, too contained. This was bigger than guilt. The kind of thing that settles into your chest and stays there and slowly changes the shape of the space around it. He didn't have a word for it yet. He would, eventually. Sloane had ended her stream. She stood with both hands around her phone, looking at the frozen last frame. The image had captured the moment Naomi said at my discretion, "Good light." His face clear and composed, Joseph beside her. Douglas in the background with the expression of a man hearing a sentence read. The image had been screenshot hundreds of times in the 4 minutes since she'd ended the stream. She thought about the woman in ivory she'd whispered to earlier, the laugh she'd aimed at her own audience. Isn't this painful to watch? She thought about the laugh. She thought about 33 minutes of footage on a federal judge's phone. She thought about what her mother had said over and over about belonging and not belonging, and who decides and what the cost is of getting it wrong. She had agreed with her mother tonight. She wasn't sure she did anymore. She was 24 years old. She needed to sit somewhere quiet and figure out what that meant. Joseph moved to Naomi's side as the crowd began to shift, small clusters of guests pulling apart, conversations zooming in lower registers, the room returning slowly to something that resembled its original configuration while being entirely different from it. He looked at her. She looked back at him. He started to say something about the agreement, about the partnership terms, about the modified conditions and what the probationary period would mean for the quarter. She shook her head once. Small. Clear. He stopped. Later, she said. He understood. "Are you all right?" he said. Instead, she was quiet for a moment. Not because she didn't know the answer, because she was finding the accurate one. "I'm tired," she said, "and I'm fine." Both of those things. He nodded. He'd been married to her mother for 31 years, and he'd raised Naomi on his own for the last 12, and he had learned, through both experiences, that when a woman tells you two true things at once, the correct response is to believe both of them. "Then let's go somewhere we can sit down," he said. She picked up the torn halves of her invitation from the table where she'd placed them, tucked them into her clutch. She would keep them, not as a trophy, not as a wound, as a record. As the specific physical evidence of what 1 hour in a marble room could reveal about the true nature of a thing. What can be understood when you walk in plainly and let the room show you who it is. Dr. Stowe appeared beside them. She offered a formal apology, genuine, specific, the kind that didn't try to soften its own edges, and Naomi received it with the attention it deserved and said what needed to be said. Then she and Joseph walked toward the exit together. The crowd watched them go. Some were still filming. Most had put their phones down. Officer Boyle held the door. Naomi paused beside him. "I'm sorry," he for earlier. "You did your job," she said. "Under difficult circumstances. I did it badly." "Yes," she said, "but you knew it. That's worth something." She walked through the door. Into the cool night. Into the sound of the city moving at its own pace, through its own concerns, entirely unbothered by what had just broken open in the marble hall behind her. Behind her, the door closed. And in the room she'd left, among the flowers and the remaining champagne, and the 200 people who had witnessed something they would be yearning over in their minds, for a long time, the air had the particular quality of the moment after. The moment when the damage is visible, when the long work of figuring out what comes next has only just begun. 3 months passed, not quietly. The footage spread the way things spread now, fast and total and without anyone's permission. By the morning after the Langford Gala, 47 separate video clips were circulating across platforms. Judge Liff's recording, Briggs's TikTok, which he had ended too late, Sloane's Instagram stream, screen recorded in full by several thousand people before she'd found the button, the museum photographer's stills, which told the story in a different register, slower, more composed, more damning for being so still. By noon the next day it was in the news. By the following morning, Vance Capital's stock had dropped 11 points at open. By the end of that week, 3 Vance Capital board members had issued individual statements. 2 of them stepped back from the audit committee pending review. One issued a statement noting he had not been present at the gala and was conducting his own internal review of company practices. Douglas issued a statement. Naomi read it once. It was careful and specific and said most of the right things in the right order. She noted what it included. She noted with equal attention what it didn't. Eleanor issued no statement at all, which was interesting, which Naomi found herself thinking about more than she expected to. Douglas, in those early weeks, did exactly what he had agreed to do. No more, no less. He engaged the independent auditors. He enrolled the leadership board in the first round of bias training. He transferred the initial installment of the $2 million fund to the independent administrative board. He did these things on schedule and without public announcement, which was part of the condition, and without visible resistance, which surprised Naomi slightly. She had expected friction, delayed compliance, a lawyer's letter asking for clarification on one of the terms. There was none of that. Just Douglas Vance, doing what he'd said he would do, in the quiet and methodical way of a man who has decided that the only currency he has left is his word and intends to spend it carefully. She didn't know what that meant about him yet. Whether it was genuine or strategic or some combination, she didn't have a word for. She filed it under observed and kept watching. Carter Foundation continued its work. That part received the least coverage. While analysts wrote about Vance Capital and commentators argued about what the footage revealed, and comment sections filled with thousands of people who had never met anyone involved, but carried strong opinions about all of them. The foundation kept operating. Grant reviews, site visits, the quarterly report, which Naomi wrote herself the way she always had. A new cohort of arts education students at a school in the Bronx who would visit the Langford Museum in the spring. A field trip the foundation had been funding for 3 years, quietly, without announcement. Naomi sat in her office on a Tuesday morning, 10 days after the gala, and drafted emails and reviewed budgets, and answered the calls she could take and returned the ones she'd missed. Her phone had been busy. That was one way to put it. Requests for interviews. Requests for statements. Requests for appearances. Endorsements. Her presence at events that suddenly very much wanted her presence, now that they understood what her presence meant. She declined most of them. Not all. She agreed to speak at one thing, a small event, a community college in Queens, a finance and entrepreneurship program for first-generation students. 60 people in a room with folding chairs and bad overhead lighting and questions that were genuine and specific and had no interest in making her into a symbol. She spoke for 40 minutes and took questions for 30 more and walked out to the parking lot feeling, for the first time in weeks, like herself again. That was the work that mattered. The coverage, the discourse, the takes and countertakes and strangers diz on the internet, telling audiences who she was, that was weather. You couldn't stop weather, but you didn't have to stand in it more than necessary. She went back to work. Briggs Vance posted a video 12 days after the gala. Not on his main account. On a new one he'd created 3 days before. No following, no prior content, no promotion of any kind. Just him in his apartment, no ring light, camera angle slightly too low, light from the window hitting him at an angle that wasn't flattering. He talked for 19 minutes. It wasn't scripted. You could tell by the way he moved through it. Starting sentences and stopping them and backing up and starting again. He said, "I don't know a lot." He said, "I've been thinking about this," and then paused and laughed a little. The kind of laugh that isn't about anything being funny. He said, "I grew up thinking that certain things were just obvious." Which, interesting, is the whole problem. The things I thought were obvious weren't some kind of universal truth. They were the view from a very specific and very comfortable window. And I mistook the view for the world. He stumbled on that last sentence, said it wrong, stopped, went back, said it again. The second version was better. Not because it was smoother, because you could hear him working at it. The video got 400 views in the first 24 hours. He didn't promote it. He left it there and went to bed. Naomi watched it the morning it came out. All 19 minutes, at her kitchen table, coffee going cold beside her. She didn't share it, didn't comment. Just watched him stumble through the sentence about the window, and then find it the second time. She finished her coffee and went to work. Then came week 10, a podcast, not a large one, 30,000 listeners, a dedicated audience, a host with a reputation for careful conversation. Briggs had reached out himself. His idea, he was trying. The host was good. She asked patient questions and gave him room to move around in them. And Briggs, who was trying, who had spent 10 weeks doing something that genuinely resembled reflection, who had deleted 4 different draft statements before posting the 19-minute video, said something. He was talking about his childhood, about the neighborhood he'd grown up in, about the unspoken lessons that accumulate in a child without anyone meaning to teach them. He was trying to make a point about how bias forms early, trying to be honest about his own formation. And he said the wrong words. Not from malice, from the precise kind of ignorance that looks like knowledge from the inside. The words came out before he heard them from the outside, before he had enough distance to understand what he'd walked into. The clip was 38 seconds. It spread faster than the original video from the gala. The response was immediate, and it was not kind, which was fair. Because the words weren't right, they simply weren't. Briggs's phone filled overnight. He sat in his apartment and read the responses. He did not call his family's communications team, which had been managing Vance Capital's public posture for weeks, and was already stretched. He did not call his mother. He did not call Douglas. He read for hours. At 2 in the morning, he called Gerald. Gerald Ossie was 53 years old. He ran bias training workshops for organizations across the city, had been doing it for 18 years. He led the first session Vance Capital's leadership board had attended as part of the conditions Naomi had set. He had the unhurried manner of someone who has heard every variety of this kind of thing and is neither surprised by it nor bored with it. He picked up on the third ring. "I said something," Briggs said. "No preamble." "I heard," Gerald said. Silence. "What do I do?" Not really a question. More like something falling and needing somewhere to land. "First thing," Gerald said, "stop trying to figure out what to do. Sit in it for a while. You don't get to rush past this one." "I wasn't trying to." "I know you weren't trying to say what you said. That's not the point right now." Briggs was quiet. "The point," Gerald said, "is that you said it anyway. Because it was in there. Because you've been saying versions of it your whole life without knowing they were versions of anything. And now you have to figure out where else it lives." A longer silence. "That's a lot," Briggs said. "Yes," Gerald said, "it is." He didn't tell Briggs it would be okay. He didn't offer a script for the morning. He didn't promise that doing the right thing now would fix what had already happened. He just stayed on the line. Briggs sat in the dark, with his phone against his ear and his laptop screen still open. the comment section still arriving in waves. And for the first time in his life, he didn't try to manage what was happening to him. He sat in it. 3 days later, he posted it in no camera, no face, black screen, white text. Short. It named the specific words he'd used and said directly why they were wrong. It did not explain his intentions. It did not ask for forgiveness or understanding or anything from anyone. At the bottom, one line, I'm going to keep learning. Not for credit. Because I should have started earlier. Gerald, when Briggs read it to him over the phone, said, "That's good." Naomi read it and said nothing publicly, which was in its own way a kind of answer. 6 months after the gala, Naomi went to the Bronx. She had a site visit scheduled at a community center she knew from 3 years of grant-making. She'd read the address on so many applications that she felt she knew the neighborhood without having stood in it. Now she stood in it. The center occupied what had once been a hardware store. High ceilings, tall front windows that let in good afternoon light. Folding tables arranged in rows, a whiteboard at the front, with a lesson written in careful block letters, household budgets. Building a savings practice. What a credit score actually measures and what it doesn't. The class had already started when she arrived. 8 women sat at the tables with notebooks open, taking notes with the attentiveness of people for whom information has immediate, practical application, not abstract, not theoretical, not for a test. For next month, for next year. Naomi stood near the doorway and watched for a moment. Then she looked at the volunteer at the whiteboard. And stopped. Eleanor Vance. No jewelry, no structured clothing, a plain cotton blouse and dark trousers and flat shoes. Retina glasses pushed up on her forehead because she kept moving between the board and the room. Her hair pulled back simply in a way that had nothing to do with occasion. She was mid-sentence when she noticed Naomi in the doorway. She stopped. The women at the tables looked toward the door. Naomi gave the room a small nod and stepped back into the narrow hallway that led toward the center director's office. Eleanor said something to the class, take 5 minutes, work through the budget exercise on the sheet, and came into the hallway. They stood 2 feet apart, the same distance as that first approach at the Langford, except everything surrounding the distance was different. How long? Naomi said. About 10 weeks. Eleanor's voice was different here. Quieter. The texture gone from it. Just a voice, without the architecture she'd built around it over decades of rooms like the Langford. I come Tuesdays and Thursdays. Does anyone here know who you are? The director does. She looked me up after I first came in. A pause. She didn't say anything about it. She just showed where the markers were and told me the class started at 11. How did you find this place? Eleanor was quiet for a moment. The question was simple, but she gave it the space it deserved. The independent board that administers the scholarship fund, one of its members runs a network of community financial literacy programs. I asked her if there was somewhere I could be useful that wasn't connected to any of our family's existing affiliations. She looked at the doorway, at the classroom beyond it. She gave me 3 addresses. I picked this one because it was the farthest from anything I'd ever been to. I thought that mattered. Naomi looked at her. At the flat shoes, at the absence of everything that had defined Eleanor's presence at the Langford. Nothing in the conditions required this, Naomi said. No, it wasn't. It's not part of any of that. Then why? Was quiet for a moment, not avoiding the question, finding the honest answer inside it, which was a different kind of quiet. I needed to be somewhere I couldn't perform, she said. Somewhere no one was watching me do the right thing and giving me credit for it. Somewhere the work was just work. She looked toward the classroom doorway. Does that make sense? It made more sense than Naomi wanted to admit right away. She looked through the doorway at the women with their worksheets, at the whiteboard with its columns, at the ordinariness of the room, the folding tables, the paper cups, the afternoon light, doing something that marble halls and crystal chandeliers were not built to do. Can I ask you something? Naomi said. Eleanor waited. The anger that night, where did it come from? Eleanor looked at the wall for a moment, then back. I'm not sure it was anger, she said. I looked at you the way you were standing, watching my husband, like you had every right to be exactly where you were, and I felt. She stopped. Found the word, threatened, which is absurd, I know. Why absurd? Because you weren't threatening me. You were standing there. Yes, Naomi said. I was. Eleanor looked at her directly. Something in her face shifted. Not tears, but the movement that happens in the deeper muscles when something true is being said and the body knows it before the mind catches up. I built a very specific picture of what this world looked like, she said slowly. Who belonged in which parts of it? What certain things meant. And you didn't fit the picture. And instead of asking why you didn't fit, instead of wondering whether the picture was wrong, I decided the problem was you. Naomi let that land where it needed to. I've spent most of my life getting very good at not seeing certain things, Eleanor continued. I thought it was discernment. I thought I was curating, having standards. She said the last two words, without bitterness and without self-pity. Just honesty. It was fear. It was only ever fear. Fear that if the order of things shifted, I wouldn't know who I was in it. And now, Naomi said. Eleanor glanced back toward the classroom, at the 8 women, toward the whiteboard. I'm finding out, she said. For the first time in a while, I think I'm actually finding out. They stood in the hallway. The building made its old building sounds. Someone in the classroom laughed at something on the worksheet. Tuesdays and Thursdays, Naomi said. Yes, keep coming, not warmly. Not as absolution, as a statement of what the situation required. Eleanor received that way. A simple, solid nod. The nods up to someone accepting terms they've already decided to honor. She went back to her class. Naomi stood in the hallway for a moment longer. Then she went to find the center director and do what she'd come to do. On her way out, an hour later, she passed the classroom doorway again. Eleanor was at the board, marker in hand, explaining something about interest rates to a woman who was nodding slowly and writing it down. The reading glasses were on her nose now. She didn't look up. Naomi kept walking. 12 months after the gala, Naomi and her father had their first real argument. Not the circling kind that families with money and competing stakes tend toward. The careful managed kind where both people are aware of what they're not saying. The actual kind. Raised voices, a closed door, the specific discomfort of two people who love each other and disagree completely. It started with a number. It always started with a number in their family. Joseph's communications director had put together a proposal. The 1-year mark of the Vance partnership was approaching. The quarterly review had come back clean, all conditions being met, several ahead of the original schedule. The independent audit had concluded. Its findings were being shared with the relevant organizations, including, as required, with Judge Wycliffe's team, whose investigation had resulted 3 months earlier in a service the Vance subsidiary under review. A settlement that included structural changes to that company's hiring practices and a financial contribution to a workforce development fund. The story, as Joseph's team framed it, was a good one. A company held accountable, a framework that worked, a model worth sharing. Joseph came to Naomi's office on a Wednesday afternoon and laid out the plan. A joint press release, both foundations acknowledged. The scholarship numbers, the audit results, the training program completion data. A narrative about what private sector accountability could look like when the right mechanisms were in place. It was a well-constructed plan, the kind of thing that would be received well and covered widely. Naomi listened to all of it. Then she said. Joseph blinked. No, Baba. She used the word she'd used for him since she was small. Not to soften anything, just because it was what she called him, and she could disagree with him completely and still know exactly who he was to her. These conditions were set specifically, so the Vance family could not convert with this work into their own image, she said. Her voice was steady, even. That was the architecture of the whole thing. If we issue a joint release, we hand them exactly what the conditions were designed to prevent. This isn't about their image. It's about showing that the model works. Other companies. That's not the only reason you want to do this. He stopped. You want to do it because Carter Global is also in this story, she said. And a story about accountability that worked reflects well on the person who designed the accountability framework. A pause. That's partly true, he said. Then we're not doing it for clean reasons. Naomi. He took a breath. He was a tall man, and when he was frustrated, he had a habit of standing very straight, as if posture could substitute for the words he hadn't found yet. The value of demonstrating that this kind of framework produces real results that goes beyond us. If other organizations see that genuine accountability is possible and generates measurable change, that's worth more than any one company's reputation. Maybe. But the way we tell that story matters as much as the story itself. She held his gaze. We don't get to use the Vance family's compliance as proof of Carter Global's ethics. Even if both things are true, the telling makes it about us. And it shouldn't be about us. That's not louder, just clearer. You built this company on the question of whether a thing is right, not whether it works. I'm asking whether this is right. He was quiet. The office held its afternoon light. The city side moved through its own business. On the wall behind Naomi's desk, a photograph from a foundation site visit. A classroom in the Bronx, children at tables, a teacher at a board. Joseph had been the one who'd had it framed and given it to her when she took the VP role. He looked at it now, then at his daughter. She was sitting straight in her chair, both hands flat on the desk, her face calm in the way it got when she had thought something through to its end and was simply waiting for the other person to arrive there too. He had watched her grow into this, had watched it happen over years, the way you watch a tree grow, not noticing the individual days, only the shape of what becomes visible when enough time has passed. "When did you get so much better at this than me?" he said. "I learned from you," she said, and then I kept going. Something in his face shifted, not offense, something that moved the other direction entirely. "Your grandmother," he said, "she would have done exactly this." Said no in exactly that tone, with exactly that expression on her face. "I know, she would have been right too." Yes, he stood, straightened his jacket, the small habitual movement of a man gathering himself to return to the rest of his day. At the door he paused with his hand on the frame. "No press release," he said, "but we document the model. Internally. For when the time is right, when the Vance family's name isn't part of the story being told." Naomi considered this. "When the work stands on its own," she said. "Yes, agreed." He left. She turned back to her desk. She sat for a moment with the quiet, with the photograph on the wall, with the particular satisfaction of having said a hard thing to someone she loved and having said it well. Then she opened her laptop and went back to work. Sloan Vance enrolled in a course 14 months after the gala. Not a degree program. A continuing education course at a university extension, socials impact and nonprofit management. Tuesday evenings, 3 hours, a room with 22 students ranging from 20 to 60 years old. She told no one in her family. She told no one on her platforms. She just went. Week 1, she sat in the back. Said nothing. Took notes on her phone because she'd forgotten to bring a notebook and felt a small, unfamiliar embarrassment about it. The kind that comes from ordinary failure in a room where no one is watching your ordinary failures with particular interest. Where you're just a person who forgot to bring something. She'd spent a long time in rooms where every ordinary thing about her was watched. This was different. Week 3, she answered a question. Not well, not with the easy, performed confidence of the woman who had aimed her camera at a stranger and whispered, "Isn't this painful to watch?" Just a regular answer. The kind you give when you think you might know something and you decide to say it out loud and see what happens. The professor said good point and moved on. Sloan wrote in her notes, good point, not to remember the professor's response. To remember what it felt like to say something real in a room where the only thing that counted is the quality of the thought. She'd spent 24 years in rooms where the opposite was true. She kept going. Every Tuesday, 3 hours. The same 22 people, some of whom she was beginning to know by name, none of whom knew who she was. By the time the scholarship ceremony came around at month 18, something in her relationship with her phone had shifted. She still used it, still had an audience, still posted, but the architecture of why she posted had changed in a way she could feel even when she struggled to explain it. Less, look at me. More, look at this. Small difference, everything in practice. The scholarship ceremony was on a Thursday afternoon in October. 18 months after the night at the Langford Museum. Not a marble hall, not a hotel ballroom. The main auditorium of a university in Brooklyn, functional, chairs in rows, a small stage, good acoustics. A banner that read Carter Foundation in plain letters, no other name anywhere on it. 20 students. Naomi had read every application herself, all 20. She'd insisted on it even after the review committee had done its work. She wanted to read the words these young people had written about why they were here. What they were going to do with it, what the money meant in the context of the lives they were actually living. She'd read them on a Sunday at her kitchen table with the windows open, and she'd taken a long time with each one. When she finished, she sat for a while without doing anything else. Then she'd closed the folder and gone for a walk. The ceremony was not long. Remarks from the Foundation's education director. A few words from a faculty member who had watched the program develop from proposal to reality. And then the students, one by one, crossing the stage to receive the formal documentation of their awards. Naomi sat in the front row and watched them come. 20 different faces: finance, technology, business administration, economics. 20 different stories with 20 different distances traveled to get to this room. But something ran through all of them consistently. Something in how they stood on that stage for a moment before stepping back down. The awareness of being seen, of being considered worth the investment before they'd proven anything to anyone. She knew what that felt like from the inside. She'd grown up with it. The gift of being believed in before the evidence existed. Not everyone got that. These 20 students were getting it today. Partly because of a night 18 months ago, when someone had decided that a woman in a $47 dress didn't belong in a room her family had helped pay for. There was a girl, 19 years old, finance and economics, double major. From a family where, she'd written in her application, no one had completed a 4-year degree. She was going to be the first. She came across the stage and accepted the folder and shook the education director's hand and stood for a moment at the front, the way they all did. With that particular stillness, then she looked out at the rows of seats. Her eyes found Naomi, maybe because Naomi was in the front row. Maybe because of something harder to name. The instinct of someone whose life had been shaped by people's decisions about who belongs and who doesn't. Recognizing a face connected to a decision that had mattered. She looked directly at Naomi and said into the quiet of the auditorium, "Thank you for not leaving that night." That was all. She stepped off the stage. Naomi sat with those words for a long time. The girl hadn't been there. She'd read about it, watched the footage, the way everyone had. But she understood, with the understanding of someone who knows what it means when door stays open instead of closing, that the whole of what had followed came from one decision. The choice to walk back through those doors. Not to take the easier path, not to let the night be over and carry the quiet dignity of departure. To turn around, to go back in, to stand in the center of the room and let the truth arrange itself. The choice to stay. It had seemed in the moment like the only available option. Now she understood it differently. It had been a choice, made in a specific second, with consequences that spread outward in ways she couldn't have mapped at the time. 20 people on a stage in Brooklyn, an investigation settled, 47 videos watched by people who would carry what they saw into their own rooms and their own moments. Eleanor Vance on Tuesdays and Thursdays with her reading glasses on her nose. Briggs, somewhere in this auditorium, sitting quietly. All of it from 1 second, one door. She looked up. Briggs was 3 rows back to the left. He'd asked through an intermediary whether his presence would be unwelcome. Naomi had said he was allowed to be there, which was not an invitation. He understood the difference. He'd come anyway, and he'd sat where he could see the stage without placing himself in anyone's direct sightline. He watched the students, watched Naomi receive the girl's words. He didn't look away from it. He'd been learning slowly and with significant difficulty to not look away from the things that were uncomfortable to witness. Gerald had pointed out early on that looking away was the beginning of most of the damage, not the dramatic hatred, not the cruelty, but the ordinary, habitual, practiced art of not seeing. He was practicing the opposite. It was harder than it sounded. After the formal ceremony, people gathered in the lobby. Coffee in paper cups. The warm, low noise of a room that is genuinely glad about why it's there. Students and faculty and family members and foundation staff and the center director from the Bronx who had brought 2 of the women from Eleanor's Tuesday-Thursday class. Naomi moved through it, spoke to everyone who came to her, answered questions that were real, was present in the way she was when she was doing the work that mattered to her. At some point, she looked across the lobby and saw Briggs standing alone near the door. Not hovering, not trying to position himself near her. Just standing with his paper cup, watching the room, looking like someone who has learned that you don't always need to be in the center of a moment to be part of it. He noticed her looking, She gave him a small nod, not forgiveness. That wasn't hers alone to give, not approval, not a signal of anything that could be used. Just you're here. I see that you're here. He nodded back. Turned back to the room. Sloane arrived, 20 minutes after the ceremony ended. Her Tuesday evening course had run over. A guest speaker, a long question period, the kind of class you don't want to leave early. She'd texted Briggs from the parking lot. Save me a cup of coffee. She came through the lobby doors in her plain navy coat, found her brother near the door, and stood beside him. They didn't hug. They stood next to each other, which for them was its own thing. How was it, she said. Good. He looked at the students still moving through the lobby. Really good. She looked toward the auditorium doors. At the Carter Foundation banner still visible through them, at the clean absence of any other name. There's no Vance anywhere, she said. No, that was the point. Yes, she stood with that. Good, she said. One word carrying several things at once. Good that the condition had been right. Good that it was being honored. Good that something they had been part of, though the worst of what they had been part of, had produced something standing in this lobby today, real and funded and completely free of what their name meant. Joseph was not there. Naomi had not invited him, not because she didn't want him there, because the Carter Foundation was hers. The scholarship program was hers. This work, this specific, unannounced, no one filming, this work of ensuring that 20 young people crossed that stage today was hers. He understood. She had texted him one photograph before the ceremony began, taken from her seat, the stage empty, the banner above it, the auditorium filling behind her. He had texted back 4 words. Your grandmother would be proud. She'd put the phone in her pocket and the ceremony had begun. The sun was lower when she walked out of the building afterward. October light with that quality it carries. Golden, a little mournful, the way October light has always seemed to know what comes after it. She stood on the steps. The city moved around her at its own pace, through its own concerns, entirely unbothered by the small and real thing that had just happened in this auditorium in Brooklyn. She was glad about that. Glad there were no cameras outside this building. Glad the story of 20 students crossing stage was theirs, not content. She breathed in the October air. She thought about the girl, 19 years old, first in her family. Thank you for not leaving that night. She thought about the women in Eleanor's Tuesday-Thursday class with their notebooks. She thought about Briggs at 2 in the morning, reading, not managing. She thought about the long road, how it didn't end with a ceremony or a clean number in a report. How it just kept going, how that was the nature of it and also the point. She walked down the steps and flagged a cab. The driver had talk radio on at low volume, someone arguing about something she didn't listen closely enough to identify. She looked out the window at the city going past. She was not thinking about the Langford, not replaying what had been said or measuring the distance between that night and this one. She was thinking about next week, the Foundation's Education Committee, a new grant application from a program in the Bronx she'd been reviewing carefully. A call she needed to return to Dr. Okafor, who wanted to discuss a healthcare equity initiative and whether the foundation might want to be involved. The daily, necessary, patient work of it, the kind that doesn't make news, the kind that accumulates over years into something you can point to and say, that is what we built. She was 25 years old. She had a lot of road left. Outside the window, Brooklyn gave way to the bridge, and then Manhattan came into view. Its lights beginning to sharpen in the early evening, its outline familiar and entirely itself. She watched the way she'd been watching the city her whole life, not needing it to be anything other than what it was. And somewhere in her chest, in the place where the weight had been living for 18 months, she felt something shift. Not gone, not lifted away, just differently arranged. The way you arrange something when you stop fighting it and start carrying it. When you understand that carrying it is not a burden but the actual work. The work that changes you slowly. The work that in changing you changes the room. She turned from the window, opened her laptop, began reading the grant application from the Bronx. The cab moved through the evening traffic. The city did what it always does. And the work continued, steady and without an audience, in the way of tough things that are built to last.